Today on All Things 80s, does size matter? Welcome back to All Things 80s. Does size matter? Yes, it does. And today we're going to take a look at the many different scales of action figures that I had growing up. My first exposure to the world of action figures was this, Action Jack. Action Jack was a very inexpensive toy that was available in the UK and Europe in the late 70s, early 80s, and these were produced by a company called Star Toys, but were simply a cheap knockoff version of the Matchbox mobile action command figures. Action Jacks came in little cardboard boxes and were packaged with a plethora of accessories applicable to the character being depicted. These were the ultimate pocket money toys, as each figure only cost 25 pence in the early 80s, and when taking inflation into account, that translates to £1.08 in today's money, which is $1.40. Whether it was by design or not, the best feature of Action Jacks was the fact that by removing his head, you could swap out the limbs and make your own custom figure, although this did require quite a lot of patience as it was an extremely fiddly process. These figures stood at just under 3¼ inches tall, and as these were my first ever action figures, this became the standard by which all other action figures were judged. Following Action Jack, my next figures were the Adventure People from Fisher-Price. The Adventure People first hit the shelves in 1975, but it wasn't until the early 80s that I first experienced them. I absolutely loved these figures due to their solid construction, which could take a beating, and also the fact that the characters portrayed were for the most part everyday men and women that represented something we as children could aspire to become. These figures had 5 points of articulation, but unlike most other action figures, the neck joints also allowed for an up and down movement, which wasn't necessarily a good thing, as this would invariably become loose and the figure was left permanently staring at his feet. The fact that these figures didn't come with any of the accessories we typically associate with action figures really wasn't an issue, as they came with vehicles and play sets that were extremely durable, which made for hours of robust play. The Adventure People utilised what was to become the industry standard of 3¾ inch scale, and as a child I felt this was far superior to the Action Jacks, despite only being ½ an inch taller. The next line of action figures I got involved with needs no introduction. It was, of course, Star Wars. Now, there's nothing I can add to the discussion about Kenner Star Wars figures that hasn't been said before, except to say that these figures became the standard for judging all other action figures. Star Wars figures had everything you could ask for. They came with weapons and a slew of vehicles and playsets that worked so well with their 3¾ inch scale. I was so heavily invested in Star Wars figures that it didn't occur to me that other action figures came in different sizes. In fact, such was my devotion to Kenner's Star Wars figures that, despite being a huge fan of the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon, I never owned a single He-Man figure. That's not to say I didn't want a He-Man figures, but it all came down to economics, and as one He-Man figure cost the same as 3 Star Wars figures, I simply couldn't justify spending my pocket money in that way. Not only that, I'd become so accustomed to the 3¾ inch scale that any other size of figure, it just felt odd. The 3¾ inch scale simply worked. Despite my aversion to spending 3 Star Wars figures worth of pocket money on one Masters of the Universe figure, I did break down in 1983 when Galoob offered us their line of 6-inch A-Team figures. Such was my admiration for Mr. T as B.A. Baracus, I just had to get this figure, but I knew it would be a one-off as I had no desire to own the other figures available in this line. I really did enjoy this figure, and Galoob did a great job both in terms of the figure and the amount of detailed accessories that accompanied it. There was, however, one major drawback to a figure of this size, and that was the fact that it was just too impractical to produce screen-accurate vehicles to this scale. Given that BA's GMC van was one of the most iconic vehicles of the 80s, it would have gone so well with this figure, But the problem, of course, was the fact that a vehicle to accommodate 6-inch figures would have been enormous and would have come with an equally enormous price tag, putting it out of the reach of most children. Galoob did address this by releasing a series of 3 and 3/4 inch A-Team figures, complete with the aforementioned GMC van and Faces Corvette, but this range held no interest for me and I quickly moved on. I've purposely not mentioned Action Man in this video because I've always considered him to be more of a doll than an action figure. I should, however, point out that I was a huge fan of Action Man, and I do recall getting some knockoff versions of Action Man vehicles, which given Action Man's 12-inch scale were absolutely huge, which reaffirms the point I'm trying to make in this video. I'm also assuming it was their knockoff status that made them affordable to my parents. Anyway, by the mid-80s, Palitoy began to see sales of Action Man decline, due in part to the success of the 3 and 3/4 inch scale Star Wars figures. Not to be outdone, Palitoy got on board and gave us Action Man reduced down to a 3 and 3/4 inches in a new line of figures called Action Force. Sometime in 1984, I'd lost interest in Star Wars and briefly turned my attention to Action Force. Having spent the previous 4 years playing with Star Wars figures, it was very easy to transition into Action Force, given the similar scale and 5 points of articulation. While I never embraced Action Force to the same extent as Star Wars, I did enjoy these figures, and the fact that they utilised the tried and tested scale meant there were numerous vehicles that were obtainable to children of the time. My time with Action Force was relatively short-lived, so I never got to experience the introduction of G.I. Joe, which happened when Hasbro took over the Palitoy operations and used Action Force as a means to bring their successful American line into Europe. The last line of action figures I had as a child came from Kenner's Mobile Armoured Strike Command series, or M.A.S.K for short. Standing at just under 3 inches, these were by far the smallest action figures I collected. It didn't take me at all long to get used to this size of figure, and I especially liked the fact that the smaller scale meant there were numerous vehicles that were within reach of my pocket money. Another excellent thing about this line was the fact that unlike Star Wars, the purchase of a vehicle was not met with the tagline, "Action figures sold separately," they were included. Furthermore, if you wanted to purchase just the figures, they came in packs of 2 on a card back very similar in size to Star Wars. Yet another benefit of the smaller scale. The figures themselves had one significant advantage over the Star Wars figures, and that was the addition of knee articulation, which allowed them to sit perfectly in their vehicles. What might be seen as a disadvantage was the lack of handheld accessories. However, given the much smaller scale of these figures, you can guarantee they would have been lost within minutes of purchase anyhow. But to make up for it, they did come with some really cool removable helmets. So in summary, what was the perfect size for an action figure? Well, initially I was going to come out and say that without question it was the 3 and 3/4 inch scale. But having reacquainted myself with M.A.S.K, I'm now not so sure. Obviously, Star Wars figures are the quintessential toy from the 80s, but they weren't entirely without fault, and the fact that M.A.S.K figures did possess the extra articulation in the legs, coupled with the affordability of the smaller vehicles, makes me question my initial thought. I will say this, 6 inches is just too big. Yes, they were highly detailed and came with numerous accessories, but they were just impractical on a number of levels. I'm going to take the easy way out and say that I really can't decide, but I would love to hear what you think in the comments below. So anyway, I thank you for watching. Please like, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video looking at all things 80s.